Now that we have our Dockerfile, we can use Docker to follow these instructions defined in this file and build our Docker image for Dockerizing our basics application we have in here. Here we can see that we are located in the basics folder where we have our Dockerfile, and from here we can execute Docker build. In this case, we are telling Docker that it should use a Dockerfile to build a new Docker image. We are going to pass the T flag that stands for tag, and we are going to pass here Docker basics. Using the T flag is the exact same thing as using the tag flag, because we can pass the name of the image and also you can pass the tag. We could use something like latest in here, so we are passing the name of the image itself and also the tag that we want to create. In our case, we will just pass the name and we will pass just the T flag because it is shorter. And also we are going to pass a dot here. Now this dot in here is the build context. Since we are located in this folder, in the basics folder, when we pass this dot here, we are passing the whole content of our folder. So this little dot in here represents this whole layer that we have in here. It is the build context that we are sending to the Docker builder for it to use when it creates our image. So we are passing the name of the image that we have and also the build context that contains our Dockerfile and also all the content that we want to use for building our application. You can see in this case, when we execute this, we have the output. So we have load metadata for Docker.io library Golang 124. And take a look at these lines you have in here. In this case, we are using the from keyword and we are using Golang 124. This is the signature of the image that we are using. Here we have cache step 2 of 5 using worddir. Again, cache 3 of 5 copy. So we are copying everything from the build context into /application. Then we are running go mod download and finally building our application, and that's it. But you can take a look at here and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 out of 5. These numbers that you can see in here are showing us the different layers that we will have in our Docker image. Every instruction that you put in your Docker file creates a new layer on the final image. For example, using the from keyword will create one layer. This will be another layer. So we have 2, 3, 4, and 5. So all these steps are the different layers that you have in the final Docker image. And Docker will check the content that you have in each of these steps, checking if they change, so it can use that content from the cache or it can use the content from the actual context. You can see in our case, the building took 3.2 seconds. If we execute this again, 1.8 seconds. If you execute this again, 0.5 seconds. And you can see that everything in here is coming from the cache. So Docker is looking at the content inside each of these different layers. And if something changed, Docker will execute from this line everything again, so it can cache all the different layers. That's why it is really important for you to know that every keyword that you put in here that is affecting the output of the image will be adding a new different layer to the final Docker image. You can see that whenever we run our application, it is saying missing HTTP server port, environment variable. So the application requires this environment variable to be defined in there. One thing we can do just before executing our application is use the environment keyword to define an environment variable that we require in our application. In this case, HTTP server port. And we are going to define this to 8080. What we are specifying in the Dockerfile is our application requires an environment variable called HTTP server port, and the default value that we want to use is 8080. When having this definition, we can change and override this variable later whenever we are running the Docker image. But in this case, we are defining that our image requires an environment variable. After this change, if we execute Docker build again, you can see that we are still having 5 layers. That's because adding environment variables to the Dockerfile is not adding more layers to the final image, because we are not changing the content of the image itself, we are just changing the behavior. Now, whenever we change the from image we are using, or whenever we copy more content, or we alter the operating system content by running a specific command, in this case, these are creating new layers, and we need to know this because the more layers our image has, the more complex the image gets, and the heavier it will be once Docker finishes building our image. After building our image here, you can execute Docker images, and you can see we have our Docker basics with the tag latest. This is the image ID that we just created, and you can see created 59 seconds ago, and it weighs 1.26 gigabytes. This will be important later, but for now just see that we have the image created and it is weighing 1.26 gigabytes. In the next lesson we will see how to execute our Docker images now that we have them available.